Now, I'm sitting here next to you, and if you're going back inside, I'm following you inside, and if you're going home, I'm following you there too.
With all my heart, I'll say sorry. Just stop running away from me like some fool of a moody schoolchild.
I just don't like you no more.
In this episode, we're going to be covering some of the Oscar picks for this year, some of the best picture, the best original screenplay, best adapted screenplay. Because we're talking about so many different movies, we're going to put like a little warning at the bottom. If you haven't seen them, you'll see a little warning pop up that says like we're about to talk about XYZ, and that'll disappear once we're done. So you can avoid all those spoilers there. But again, if you haven't seen them, want to go see them, go watch the movies, come back, pause it, save it for a watch later, and let us know in the comments what you think about our picks, some that we're missing. You're also going to see some of these actual interviews, like we spoke with Leslie from All Quiet on the Western Front. You'll see a link to that below. You can go read that article, learn more about the making of the film, how they wrote that, and a handful of these nominees that we've actually talked to with the magazine, with creative screenwriting.
Ultimately, it was kind of twofold. One was to read the novel multiple times, buy many copies, rip it up, put it on the wall, figure out what scenes we wanted to do, and then get to the essence of what the author was trying to say. What's the main thematic premise of it? What are the things we really want to track on? And what are the problems?
Well, welcome to episode 3. We're going to be talking about our kind of Oscar picks, but more so like what we like about Best Pictures this year, adapted screenplay, original screenplay. Briefly talk about Best Picture, but more so like how it relates to adapted and original. And as a screenwriting magazine, a screenwriting publication, we're going to stick more to the real aspects of the scripts, what we like about those, and kind of some top picks. Before we dig in too far, what are your kind of overall thoughts, like kind of piling all these movies in a row, watch them? Do you see any like connective themes and threads, or what are some of your thoughts in the last couple of years of best original scripts?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of interesting because we're coming off of what, 2 years of COVID, which kind of pushed a lot of things back, and kind of had like an influx of all these things that were in production right before COVID hit, and now we're, I think, settling kind of back into more of a conventional style of release dates and blockbusters and that kind of stuff. So I think it's a pretty good mixture here. There's definitely some thematic through lines. There's a lot more I guess what you would call like a modern political tone to a lot of things here, and things, the movies that don't lean into that are kind of even more obvious. You know, when I think about like Top Gun, obviously it's about like quote unquote warring countries, but we really don't know who's fighting who. So it's kind of neutral, which I think makes it a better movie, but its absence of any kind of like political commentary is noticeable now, more than I probably would have been 5 years ago, you know?
Yeah. And that one in particular is interesting because Tom Cruise basically held it for 2 years. It's been done in the can. He wanted to make sure we came back, like you said about COVID. Steven Spielberg even kind of credits Cruise as like bringing back cinema. I mean, that's a pretty big statement. And I feel like that's why it's on this list for Best Picture. It's by far, to me, the most rewatchable movie on this list. It's the only one here, or maybe not the only one, but one of the few where I'd probably watch that once a year if it's on TV, just like all the Mission Impossibles. It's fun. It's really well written. It's very different than a lot of the other ones here that, I don't know, like you said, like it's definitely a character piece, action piece, as opposed to just theme, which I think is a lot of the take homes. It feels like it's theme related the last couple of years.
Yeah, I feel like looking over the list, it is for a fact the only one I've seen more than once, and it might be the only one I watch more than once for a while, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
It just has that natural movie popcorn. It's got a Spielberg-esqueness to it, which is kind of ironic considering Spielberg kind of tipped the cap to someone else for doing something that he's essentially known for, you know, the blockbuster, making movies something we all want to go and do together in a dark room with a big old bowl of popcorn.
I think we also, if we're just looking at the best pictures, also on that list is The Fabelmans from Spielberg, but this is his most personal work. I kind of feel like it's going to get overlooked for the most part. He does have some nominations here for Best Picture and Best Original, but I don't know. It's just like if we're talking about themes, and it feels like there's a lot of issue pieces. There is some racism against like Jewish people when he grew up.
Yeah,
but it feels like it has to have both of those things like packed on to kind of get the Oscar win for some of these. If we're going with just fun, like part of me thinks there's a small percent chance that people will just pick Top Gun as Best Picture as kind of this like overcorrection of all these things we've kind of talked about. It's just like, hey, let's just talk about good, fun movies that really don't get made anymore, especially think about the stunts and the action, the reality of what's happening in camera with this.
Yeah, I was listening to someone kind of recapping the Oscars from last year where Coda had won Best Picture, and it was like this super underdog story where it's kind of just a feel-good movie more than anything. And
Yeah.
for like all the stuff that collectively we've all been through the last couple of years, we kind of just want that, you know, that happy, warm escapism. And I think Top Gun is by far the best example of that, of this batch.
So before we get too much into screenplays, do you have a pick for your Best Picture? I mean, obviously the script's important, but Best Picture feels more like filmmaking to me. But what are you leaning towards?
Ironically, we were just talking about Top Gun. I feel like for me personally, that was what I enjoyed the most. It was probably, if I had to say objectively, the best movie going experience I had in the past year. I wouldn't say it's the best script. There's definitely a lot of things that are on the screen that probably were never on the page. Just like we were talking about, the difference between direction and screenwriting is, I guess, kind of capturing a character on a page as opposed to showing all the things that a director would have to do on screen. I think if I had to guess who was going to win, I'd probably, from what I understand, there's a lot of momentum behind Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I did watch that in theaters as it came out, kind of before it really got rolling with all the like the Redditization of it. People are really into like discussing the movie online and all the crazy draws and things that it has, seemingly like random. And then the multiverse stuff we've all seen with the Marvel in the past year. It's the best version probably of all of that. And I think it's probably the right choice as far as what's emblematic of 2022 in film. But personally, I'm still leaning towards Top Gun just because it's like a tip of the cap to, I don't know, nostalgia and things that I liked going to movies for when I was a kid.
Just want to manage expectations.
Yeah, I kind of agree with all that. Top Gun's my favorite, like we kind of said. Another one for me is like Triangle of Sadness was way up there. I feel like it's got some really big, like mixed reviews on it.
Yeah.
If you look at Gold Derby or any of those, like Everything Everywhere All at Once is kind of taking the cake. For me, like, yeah, I don't know if Marvel wasn't already doing it, if Rick and Morty didn't exist, this film would have blew me away a little bit. But because I've kind of dug into those a little bit, it felt just like a live version of that to me. I mean, so it'll probably win, but it's just like personally, like I thought it could have been a little more. We'll do a little spoiler here. I will say like the reveal of just the husband saying, you know, doing laundry with you was enough for me.
Right.
Is a big touching moment. And it's hard to kind of still get those with so much going on. So as far as execution, that was pretty perfect to get that one thing out there, this cross-dimensional, cross-galaxy type love.
Yeah.
So I feel like it'll be the front runner. I'm still kind of pulling for Top Gun Maverick, and I was just a big fan of Triangle of Sadness, I think.
Yeah, I think like you were saying with Everything Everywhere All at Once, we've seen this story done, like you were saying, in other mediums. We've seen it throughout Marvel. We've seen it on Rick and Morty, but I think this is the first one that has like a real, true human emotional story attached to it. And I think that's why it's probably the best example of something that's become super popular in the last couple of years.
Yeah, if you have to go, like, I guess probably what everyone's probably seeing would be Spider-Man 3 when we see all of them. But that's really like it's nostalgic of like you're taking our 20 years of knowledge and throwing it at us at once. So as far as a complete buttoned in story, it definitely does have all those things in it.
I think screenplays, it's an art form unto itself. And generally when we see like the match, when you get the double whammy of getting a best picture and a best screenplay win, generally it's a writer director. As an Academy member, you're thinking this guy directed it and his source material is his own material, then he had to have written the best script if he made the best movie. You know, it's kind of an odd, like a false equivalency. I think about every time I see like an animated or a foreign film nominated for best picture, and then it's also nominated for best animated or best.
Yeah.
I'm like, it has to win, right? Just by process of like logic. That's the logic in my mind of there's no way you can lose if you're one of the 10 best and you're going against 4 others that weren't nominated in your category. So I guess I feel the same way kind of about screenplays. If it's written and directed by the same person, if you made the best movie, then you're the best director. So,
yeah.
And if you wrote it too, then I guess you're the best writer as well.
I think back in the day, these strips were maybe talking about a cause, and it was kind of like a anti-big business, something like that. Bill Maher made a joke a few years ago about like now the biggest problem is us, and we kind of even see that with like Avatar 2. It's kind of about, you know, conservatism and polluting the water, and it's I don't know, there was a while where there was a lot of just like make you feel bad type nominees, which
Yeah.
maybe we're moving away some. It does feel like we're coming back to at least some character pieces within that. So let's look at best original for some of these. The Banshees of Inisherin, Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Fablemans, Tar, Triangle of Sadness. This is original.
I think for me, I look at this, I think of who wins this category, and it's the people I look up to the most. This is like a Tarantino category. This is something Jordan Peele has won before. So
Yeah.
I think of the two, this is the most coveted because it's like it's in the title, original screenplay. It's not a sequel to something. It's not adapted from anybody else's work. It's somebody sat down at a keyboard, banged out 100 pages of something incredible. So looking over the nominees here, I'm definitely a fan of the Banshees of Inisherin. It wasn't my favorite movie, but it's just one of those things you could tell while watching it that this just read really well on a page. It's basically a two-hander. There's maybe 2 or 3 side characters that have any meaningful dialogue, but it's just a few people talking to each other, and generally those are gonna be the best scripts. I always think about when I'm writing or when I'm discussing some kind of screenwriting stuff, and people are talking about when you hand this to somebody, what are they going to draw out of it? If you have 2 paragraphs of action, they're kind of skim it, but the dialogue is generally always going to be read. That's the thing people are going to want to see, and that's, I think, where most of a writer's creativity can be. I think about like Aaron Sorkin or Quentin Tarantino, like we said, it's their dialogue is their script, and I think that for me generally points to the most interesting and original screenplays. So I'm leaning towards Banshees of Inisherin here. Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think might be the front runner here, kind of like we were saying with the Best Picture stuff. I did like Tar. The movie was pretty solid, but it's kind of a tough sell, like we were saying, it being like a downer year. Like everyone's kind of coming out of everything being Debbie Downer for the last 3 or 4 years. And Triangle of Sadness kind of has that whole eat the rich theme going throughout it, which kind of feeds back into that same negativity. And then The Fablemans, personally for me, I just had an issue with a lack of like tension in that movie. Maybe like he had no obstacles that I could, in retrospect, I feel like there was no challenges. It was just Steven Spielberg being successful for 2 hours.
I definitely liked the last 30 minutes of that the most. I'd rather see from then on what happened, just as a fan of Spielberg and knowing kind of his story, walking on the lot and everything else. So I kind of agree. I like Martin McDonagh, probably one of my favorite. I'll definitely see everything he does. I think Three Billboards may be his best film. Some people would say like in Brugge, and that got a lot of actor nominations. Like Sam Rockwell won. Francis might have won for that one too.
I think so, yeah.
I definitely see what you're saying. One thing to separate, probably you and I are writing partners. I think you're probably the strongest in dialogue. I may be the strongest in plot, and that may skew some of our other views too. Because it makes totally sense what you're saying though. Like best original should be about dialogue. Tarantino won for Pulp Fiction. He also won for Django Unchained a couple of years ago. The Banshees has like the smallest amount happening. So for me, like if you compare it to Triangle of Sadness, which I don't know, again, this feels like more of a personal thing than me really. If I had to put money on it, I'd probably go for Everything Everywhere All at Once again.
Yeah.
But just that 3-act structure, it's kind of like this mini movie with this couple arguing, then it's on a yacht, and you kind of see the end of that. And it's just really an over explanation of power and taken from the rich and everything else. And then like I think at the end too is you'll see like how that power can kind of change people, and like how quickly it can change people, and that we see that in the 3rd act of that movie. So I've recommended it to a lot of people. It's definitely, I think all these are worth seeing, but that's definitely one that I kind of recommend to people.
Yeah, it definitely I like the explicitness, I guess, of the act structure there, because we literally have 3 set pieces that cut the movie into a 3rd, and it's original and unique, and I did enjoy that film. I don't want to overlook it necessarily, but I just feel like Banshees, just like I was reading, I could see Colin Farrell.
Yeah.
I don't know. It felt like characters were in the words, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very like concrete language and imagery. You can't forget him cutting off his fingers and burning the building and some of those things. And for such a confusing thing. Just that he just kind of decided he was wasting his life drinking and
It's very
whatnot with this guy.
allegorical and
Yeah.
subliminal almost.
Yeah, and all these kind of like feels like novels and Triangle of Sadness too is like maybe it's people I don't recognize, but I really only recognize Woody Harrelson in the whole movie. I'm sure there's a few other I might see, but I thought that was kind of unique coming into it, and I just really liked everything they kind of did with that movie. But tell me a little bit more about Tar. Did you see any like parallels there with like The Sound of Metal a couple years ago? Like, how do you think they maybe describe some of those absence of sound and obsessions and things on that script?
Yeah, that would be interesting to know. I know Todd Fields, writer director behind that one, he's only done a handful of films, maybe 3 or 4. He was an actor for quite a long time. Most famously, I think he was in Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick's last film. And apparently he was a big fan of Stanley Kubrick. He would just like follow him around looking for advice and trying to absorb everything that maybe the greatest American director ever did. So I think he definitely kind of borrows from that style in a way. If you think about like 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie that's 2.5 hours long, which has a 20-minute sequence with no dialogue at all. And the first 30 minutes of the movie is essentially just camera work, showing pretty much how mankind discovers tools and things like that. So I think he definitely has the influences there. How he writes that in particularly, I'd be fascinated to know. But I think what I liked about the story, it was one that I had probably heard the most about before it came out. It was like super hyped up. And Cate Blanchett, I think, is probably guaranteed to win an Oscar for this just because of the levels of this performance, how like maniacal and focused and genius. And a lot of people were under the impression that this was a documentary, or not a documentary, but an adaptation of an actual composer's life, which I thought was super interesting, just because he put that much detail and
I think it's almost like
other.
marketed that way too. I think a
Right.
little bit because I feel like when I was reading it, that's kind of what it was saying. Yeah.
So I think when you put that much hype into a character, or however you want to put it, when you frame it that way, it makes those quiet scenes maybe easier to write because Cate Blanchett's going to be in this movie. How much do I need to give her to do as a director?
Yeah.
She's fantastic. She might be our greatest living actor at the moment. Who knows? But yeah, I did like the movie a lot. It was a bit lengthy, and it definitely could cause some people. I know some people had issues with the fact that it was kind of pushing against cancel culture and using a woman as the antagonist for pushing against cancel culture. But personally, I thought that made it more interesting than if you showed like a Harvey Weinstein type and their downfall or something like that,
It feels like so hard to be one of these top 5: Banshees, Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Fabelmans, Tar, Triangle of Sadness. I feel like in the 90s you could maybe have a better chance of getting an original screenplay read today, much less made. Over 80% come from a book or some other adaptation like that. You and I were talking, like I wasn't really even aware that adapted would include any type of sequel. That's kind of an odd thing to think about that way. Even if it's something like Glass Onion, which is a sequel to Knives Out, but they're both original stories. Like if he hadn't marketed as a sequel, I guess it might have been up for an original, which is kind of an odd thing, or you hadn't used that character before, maybe. But it sounds like overall though, so it's such a small amount of these movies get made. So and like us, we really only write original stuff. We don't really try to do any adapted stuff. That feels the most creative. It feels like you have the most freedom as kind of a novice writer trying to break in. But these all should be read. I mean, they're things that are getting made. Now, there's lots of stuff to think into that of like, it's obviously, it's like, it's not Martin's first movie. It's not Spielberg's first movie. So there's a lot of things like that are also factors. But you definitely want to see, these are the scripts that are getting passed around and read and looked over and noticed year to year. All these are enjoyable though. So let's kind of move to adapted screenplays. I'll read through these as well. All Quiet on the Western Front, Glass Onion, A Knives Out Mystery, Living, Top Gun Maverick, and Women Talking. What's your favorite before we get into kind of what we think might have a chance here?
I think about these 5 movies. I think about, what do I remember if I were as a writer, what do I remember about these movies? What do I remember about what character said, what had meaningful impact from a page to a screen? And for me, it would have been my last guess, but I think Women Talking was probably the most interesting for me as a watcher, as far as the things people were saying and just all those women together in that room, just the way they're delivering their dialogue. It just makes it so, it just oozes with such a creative writing style, and something that I'm not usually prone to seek out and watch. So I was really kind of blown away watching it. Had very middling expectations. For the fact that it was nominated, I wasn't necessarily going to rush out to see it, but once I heard that it was, I decided to give it a chance. I really think it just reads incredibly well on the screen, and I'm sure on the page just as well.
Yeah, it's got a lot going on. It's definitely like a difficult adaptation. So just to kind of briefly go over what's happening, these women, which is actually in 2010, you kind of think it's a different age for
Yeah.
half the movie.
I thought that was a solid reveal too, because we're in like this pastoral farm community, and like, okay, this is like the 50s or something, you know?
Yeah.
And I think we hear a radio broadcast, and it's like 2018 or something. Here, like, oh man, it was like,
Yeah.
it was well written, well directed there.
Yeah. These women are basically being drugged and raped and have no idea what's going on. There's really nothing they can do to some degree. So they're kind of debating what to do, to leave, to stay. Then do they bring boys with them, or all men the enemy? There's so many things going on here. It's written from the perspective of maybe a dozen women kind of talking of all different ages. This victim things that are happening are between like 5 and 65, the rapes and everything else going on. One character, Ben Whishaw, I think's his name, who plays August. This is kind of what's so interesting. So we see this a little bit at the end, but he's basically like recording the minutes of all the women talking, writing down what's happening and everything else. So the book is from a female author, written by a male character who's taking the minutes of everything that's happening from all these women talking. So it's already a lot of stuff kind of happening. So just like adapting that in any way that kind of makes sense is already doing a lot. And there's also maybe some unreliable narrator parts because of that too, like some different views of perspective. And we're kind of seeing that happening. But yeah, this one really surprised me as well, that we'd both be into it, even though it's a great cast and a really interesting story here. Women Talking feels like it's mostly dialogue. Top Gun Maverick is obviously a lot of action. Living, we've seen a few times before. I don't know. It just doesn't. It feels like it's great to be nominated, but not necessarily one of the front runners here. All Quiet on the Western Front. I mean, we always kind of see war films here. This has got more plot than we've ever seen before, especially in the 1930s version. To me, it's more of a director type thing, but obviously it's nominated. Biggest surprise for me is like Glass Onion, and I love Ron Johnson. I was kind of surprised to see this one here.
Yeah, it's definitely. I feel like Knives Out. I really liked. I was really into like the vibe there, and here I really enjoyed the character LeBlanc from the original that we get, Daniel Craig. Everything he does is interesting and funny, but it kind of feels like a reheat almost, but a lesser version of that original script. I know Netflix, they signed like a multi-movie deal. I'm trying to make a franchise out of Knives Out, so expect more of these to come. I'll definitely keep up with those, but for this one, I don't know. It just kind of felt maybe over-directed to me. Maybe like less, because the first, I guess it's kind of ironic we're talking about an adapted screenplay, but it felt so original the first time around, you know.
Yeah.
And this time it kind of feels, I guess this is the sequelization of it, is the fact that character, Daniel Craig's character, is kind of what brought me over into the movie and that I enjoyed about it. So I guess the adaptation title kind of fits there. As far as All Quiet on the Western Front, I thought it was great. It looked great. One thing that would keep me from saying I bet the screenplay is just as great is because it's in a foreign language. So I feel like that kind of, in my mind, I'm not smart enough to understand how much of the translation is actually coming across, you know, and how much of this is. It's hard for me to dictate as much when I'm not hearing the English language, but that's just my own American stupidity.
And we're just looking at a handful of these. I was trying to like, is there any way to get a heads up besides like Gold Derby and what might win? I was trying to look at IMDb. I was trying to look at Ebert, which is obviously no longer Ebert, but like a collection of critics. Top Gun Maverick's got 4. Women Talking have 3 stars. The Banshees of Inisherin has 3.5 stars. Triangle of Sadness has 3. All Quiet on the Western Front only has 2. So I think from a critical point of view of best adapted, they're saying Women Talking has 3, where All Quiet has 2. And those are kind of our front runners. I don't feel like Top Gun will get any credit in the writing category. Living may, but it doesn't feel like there's enough quite happening there to kind of win. So I do think we're kind of between All Quiet and Women Talking, with Women Talking maybe having just a little bit more going on than All Quiet does, which is something a lot of people have seen in a lot of different ways. Women Talking also, like, culturally, just a few years ago, the Me Too movement was so big and happening. It's kind of another look at that. There's also some transgender issues here. I feel like there's so many things done well, whether or not they're answering as opposed to just shining a light on more questions. But I think it's maybe the most interesting. I could see reading it, even though some of these are people don't like when something feels like a play too much. Just
Yeah.
like I could definitely see this being a play, but I think it's kind of my probably pick as well for best adapted.
Going back to Women Talking, and we've had a few of those movies in the last couple of years post Me Too movement that kind of delve into like things that happen around it or kind of give us allegories based around those types of situations. And I feel like this is the best we've seen of that ripple effect, maybe is what I want to say here. So I think the fact that it's probably the best version of that and it's so well acted and well cast, it's probably got three of the best actresses and three of the top 10 actresses in the world in one room for 2 hours is interesting enough that it's probably maybe due, like Hollywood has. We can't ignore how political Hollywood can be, and the fact that the whole Me Too movement is kind of based in Hollywood, that these people may be more prone to reward something that's long overdue here as well.
It's really an emotional movie of talking about things that have already happened in a really dynamic way, where some of those that came out right when it happened, like around the Fox News stories, were just kind of cringy to watch. They're really difficult to get through. The Russell Crowe did one. I think John Lithgow did the other one. One was a movie, one was a show. I don't know. It's a lot of things going on, but really well done and on all aspects of them.
It gives it the cinematic twist that I think we hadn't had to this point that can pull you in without you realizing what you're actually consuming, which is the best type of movie for me.
So just kind of to reevaluate all those, our possible pick for adapted is Women Talking, written by Sarah Polley. Best original, Topher's leaning more towards the Banshees of Inisherin. I like Triangle of Sadness, but we both, if we had to put money, probably Everything Everywhere All at Once. We might take the cake for that one. And the same for Best Picture, even though I think we're both pulling for Top Gun Maverick as well for these.
The little 10-year-old kid inside me is ready for some more Maverick and Iceman.
Yeah. Well, that is kind of our show for this week. What do you guys think? What do you kind of think we missed or didn't get right? What are your favorite movies in these categories of Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Original Screenplay? What are you hoping to see win, and what do you think is getting overlooked as well? And there are some movies that are not listed here that you felt like they got kind of avoided or they got looked over when they should have got a nomination. Anything big that stands out in the last year that you wish we were talking about and wish the Oscars were talking about? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you next month for a brand new episode.